Hi everyone, I'm Rob Shapiro from Fitchburg State University, and today we're going to be talking about the BACB's 5th edition task list item G6, use instructions and rules. So first off, what are instructions and rules? We can think of instructions as a type of response prompt that tells a person what to do, whereas we can think of rules as statements of an antecedent behavior consequence contingency. And certainly instructions and rules are things that we use all the time, but it's just important to formalize them and really think about what they are. So again, those instructions are essentially just what to do. Here's what I would like you to do. Whereas rules go a little bit beyond simple instruction, and they actually state both the instruction as well as the behavior and then what will happen as a result of engaging in the behavior. So they state that antecedent behavior consequence contingency. Instructions and rules are important because they allow for behavior change without direct contact with the contingency. So we can think about this, that they allow behavior to come under the indirect control of temporally remote or unlikely but significant consequences. So we have the possibility that there might be some kind of a consequence that's going to occur as a result of some behavior taking place. But it's that consequence is going to happen too far after the response in question for it to actually control behavior, or it's unlikely that that consequence is actually going to happen, but it could happen. Because it's unlikely to happen, it's not going to be able to directly control behavior, but it's still really important that the learner is aware of that consequence and that it can have some impact on that learner's behavior. So we can think about these two as sort of the distinction between rule-governed versus contingency-shaped behavior. In contingency-shaped behavior, the organism has to contact that contingency directly. They have to engage in the response and immediately have some environmental change that follows that response, and that impacts behavior. So it's contingency-shaped. The organism came into direct contact with the contingency following engaging in the behavior. Whereas with rule-governed behavior, the organism does not need to contact that contingency directly. They can be told about the contingency, they can observe someone else coming into contact with the contingency, they can otherwise learn about the contingency without directly contacting it, but it still impacts their behavior. So again, that distinction, rule-governed, they don't directly contact the contingency. Contingency-shaped, they must directly contact that contingency. When we think about an example that illustrates the importance of rule-governed behavior and the use of instructions, we might have an instruction that is, look both ways before crossing the street, okay? That's purely a description of what you want the learner to do. Doesn't speak to contingency, doesn't speak to outcomes. It's just, here are the instructions. Here's what I want from you. The instruction is, look both ways before crossing the street. Now, the rule that might be attached to that instruction could be, if you don't look both ways before crossing the street, you may get hit by a car. Okay, now we're fleshing this out a little bit. We've got the instructions of look both ways before crossing the street. We've got the behavior of if you don't look both ways before crossing the street, you step out into the street without looking, the consequence, you may get hit by a car. Now, this is an example of one of those situations where it's actually unlikely that consequence is going to take place, right? There are lots of times that somebody could step out into the street without looking both ways and not get hit by a car. So it's an unlikely outcome, but it's a really important outcome for the learner to understand may take place, and it's really important that outcome impacts the learner's behavior. Okay, so the instruction, look both ways before crossing the street. The rule, if you don't look both ways before crossing the street, you may get hit by a car. And just illustrating the importance of rule-governed versus contingency-shaped behavior, what would happen if we had to learn this through contingency-shaped behavior and not rule-governed, right? Obviously, that would be really problematic. If we had to learn it by stepping out into the street without looking both ways and getting hit by a car, that's going to be really problematic, right, from a number of aspects, not the least of which is just our survival as well as the survival value of the species. So We understand that there's importance in using instructions as well as importance in rule-governed behavior, but how do we go about using instructions effectively? Clearly, these are things that we use all the time, but how do we make sure that we're using them as effectively as possible? And there are several things for us to think about. The first is we want to ensure that the response we're looking for someone to engage in is within that person's repertoire, right? If they're not able to engage in what we're instructing them to do, or if they don't have the component skills to be able to follow through on those instructions, it's going to be very difficult for them to be successful. Second, we want to ensure that reinforcement is being delivered, right? When a learner does follow instructions, we want to deliver some sort of reinforcement, ideally reinforcement that's high quality, of sufficient magnitude to occasion ongoing responding. Third, we want to provide a supportive context and environment to giving instructions. And this, if we just think about this from more of a natural environment situation. If instructions are delivered in a harsh manner or an environment that's been paired with punishment, it's going to be more difficult to expect a learner to follow through on those instructions. And even if they do follow through, it's more likely to occasion the environment as being aversive, and the situation in general as being a reflexive condition motivating operation, and is more likely to have that learner avoid that environment in the future. Whereas if the context is supportive, positive, paired with reinforcement, it's more likely that a learner is going to follow through with those instructions, gain access to that reinforcement, and then be willing to engage in that environment in the future. Fourth, we want to determine whether the learner generally responds to instructions or rules, or if their behavior is primarily contingency shaped. We can think about responding to instructions or rules as being a class of behavior unto itself. And if there's no learning history of a learner being reinforced for following through with instructions, that behavior may not be likely to occur. If we've got a learner who primarily is responding only to direct contingencies, we may have some work to do before we can expect instructions to be an effective mechanism of changing behavior. We also want to be alert for competing contingencies. We may have a situation where we're giving someone instructions to engage in some behavior, and they may be perfectly competent at following instructions, but there may be other contingencies in play that make that learner less likely in the moment to engage in that behavior. If we go back to our rule that we talked about earlier of if you don't look both ways before crossing the street, you may get hit by a car, right? Well, we may say to a learner, and obviously this is probably not something that we would do, we may say to a learner, just walk right out into the street without looking. Okay, we're giving them instructions, but there may be competing contingencies, or in this case, competing rules that they've learned that conflict with the instructions that we're giving to them and may minimize the likelihood that they will follow through on the instructions that are being delivered. When we're delivering instructions, we want to use stimuli that are in the learner's repertoire. If we've got learners that have a good, solid listener repertoire, have good, solid vocal, verbal behavior, we may be able to give our instructions purely verbally and have it be successful. But if we've got someone who struggles with their listener repertoire, struggles with their vocal verbal behavior, or is in a stressful situation, or it's a really novel set of instructions, we may want to pair that vocal verbal stimuli with gestures or sign or other methods of providing those instructions in a way that is going to be easily digested by our learner. Next, we may want to think about presenting instructions rapidly, minimizing downtime, and building momentum. We can think of this as a high probability sequence or behavior momentum, right? If we present our instructions in relatively rapid sequence and not allowing a lot of downtime between them, we may be in a situation where we prevent our learners from engaging in off-task behavior, or where we're able to build that momentum of I followed instructions and I got reinforced, and so I'm going to continue following instructions that are given reasonably rapidly. And then finally, we may want to combine our instructions with goal setting and modeling. Sometimes just providing instructions cannot be sufficient, but if we work with our learners to identify specific goals, specific degrees to which that we're looking for them to follow instructions, that may be paired with some reinforcement that's being delivered for meeting whatever that goal is, that may make our instructions more effective. And we may, and this pairs with using stimuli in the learner's repertoire. There may be times where we want to pair our instructions with providing modeling of what following those instructions might look like, to be able to achieve competent performance. For example, if you're a coach and you're let's say you're coaching soccer, we can talk to our players about a specific move that we want them to accomplish. We can tell them what it looks like, but there's probably not going to be a substitute for us actually demonstrating that move to our players, so they can combine those vocal verbal instructions with actually seeing the skill being executed. It's much more likely we're going to get behavior that we're looking for out of our players by doing that. So that sums up our strategies for using instructions, as well as the difference between rule-governed and contingency-shaped behavior.